Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. This week, bringing you a special American Probation and Parole Association edition. As the voice of the community corrections industry, APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. In addition to their U.S. members, the American Probation and Parole Association is supported by international members who are actively involved in strengthening community corrections work in their own countries. APPA's International Relations Committee aims to connect community corrections professionals around the world to inspire and share insights from their unique experiences and best practices. Welcome to this special APPA episode of The Criminologist. And now, welcome your host, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 125 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are bringing you our second special hybrid edition as we are once again teaming up with our good friends at the American Probation and Parole Association, in particular, their International Relations Committee. We hope to weave in more of these special edition episodes in the future, so please stay tuned. And if you are a first-time listener joining us via the American Probation and Parole Association, welcome to the program. Now, for those of you who may not be aware of the American Probation and Parole Association, or APPA, allow me to bring you some brief contextual information before I share my conversation with this week's very special guest. The American Probation and Parole Association really is the voice of the community corrections industry. APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. Their work is supported by thousands of passionate members throughout the United States, Canada, as well as other countries actively involved in strengthening community corrections work. APPA has members at all levels of the government and the private sector, including community corrections professionals, service providers, libraries and educators, research students, volunteers, concerned citizens, corporations, public policy advocates, and others with an interest in criminal and juvenile justice. Everything APPA does is aimed at reducing recidivism to keep our communities safe. That means strengthening the role of the community corrections industry. Now, prior to the founding of APPA, community corrections professionals had no collective voice. Having no national representation, fighting for best practices and policies in our field inspired some of America's most distinguished correctional administrators to act. Those collective accomplishments have manifested in a variety of ways. For those of you in the field, APPA publishes research reports, guides, hosts webinars, and other web-based products and services. As to professional development, APPA has their outstanding training institute, along with their unbelievable leadership institute, which I encourage any of you in leadership roles to participate in. They also host on-site training as well as online trainings. And finally, as to promoting best practices, APPA advocates for evidence-based practices and policies in the field, organizes committees, hosts issue-specific workshops, and leads focus groups. And now, a little bit about this week's guest, Stephen Pitts. Stephen Pitts is an independent consultant in criminal justice and founder of Community-Based Justice. He is passionate about creating and strengthening probation delivery services internationally. He is proud to hold the role of International Ambassador to the Confederation of European Probation, CEP, is also a senior expert with the Netherlands Helsinki Committee, and has done a lot of work with other international organizations, including the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and with a variety of governmental and non-governmental organizations or NGOs all around the world. Now please, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Stephen Pitts. And I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Stephen. So glad you could join us. And thank you so much for being a guest for another one of our APPA special editions, in which we are hoping to specifically shine a light on and highlight some of the great work being done by the IRC, the International Relations Committee of APPA. So, that being said, why don't we start this conversation by you telling our audience just a little bit about yourself, generally speaking, a little bit about your background, both educationally and professionally, maybe touch on some of those milestones, if you would, Stephen, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much indeed for having me. It's really an absolute pleasure. I grew up and then later trained in the southwest of England. It's a rural area, and I trained 50 years ago. Next year, it will be 50 years that I presented my first social inquiry report as a nervous young trainee.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you very much. So yes, I trained in that area. It's a popular tourist destination. It's very beautiful, actually. But, behind the scenes, as is so often the case in beautiful areas, there was poverty, there was declining industry. But for me, it was a good grounding in probation work, in one-to-one work, including balancing, helping to address offending needs on the one hand and the enforcement of the order of the court on the other. And that's a challenge that's still very, very much with us, of course. Neither social worker nor police officer, but a unique role in between, as one of my European colleagues said recently. Much has changed since then, since the 1970s. We work with many higher-risk people. Our technology has advanced hugely. We have a much better understanding of what works, the evidence-based practice of responsivity. That, I think, is still growing and will be a focus of the Fifth World Congress, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later. International exchange and collaboration has developed hugely too, and that's been the focus of a lot of my work for the last 20 years. Joe, perhaps I should just add a note here. I use the term probation, and that's the way, in the sense that we tend to use it in the United Kingdom and in Europe, as a shorthand for probation, parole, community corrections. So whenever you hear me talk about probation, I'm not actually focused specifically on the probation order or that part of our whole width of work, but as I say, it's a shorthand for probation, parole, everything that's done in community corrections.
Yes, and thank you. We tend to do the same thing here in the States. We use that term probation, but it's part of that larger umbrella, as you noted, of the community corrections and whatnot. Yeah. So, Stephen, here in the United States, we often reference Robert Martinson's infamous 1974 declaration that, quote, nothing works, unquote, as sort of our turning point for when our what works trajectory took a turn. Talk about the events in London in 1980, which similarly served as a turning point for probation in the UK.
Yes, well, indeed. Well, I started my qualified career in London, where incidentally later on I studied for my master's degree in organisational behaviour, a degree which has since served me well, including in capacity work, in capacity building work in probation, which is a subject I hope we may touch on later. But yes, to come to your question, London, 1979, 1980, a time of civil disturbance, the most significant civil disturbances that we've had in the country in my lifetime. And indeed, it was a turning point in our work. We needed to step beyond one-to-one work, important as that is, to extend our focus, to consider a whole range of what we might term social factors, and fundamentally to revisit and re-emphasize the importance of community, working with, involving, harnessing the know-how, the goodwill, the resources of the community. And to give you a pictorial image here, our offices at the time of those civil disturbances were situated like the numbers on a clock face around the perimeter of the area in which we were working. And we established a new office right in the centre of town, and it became a centre point, inviting service users and community groups into the centre, a probation and community centre, addressing multiple needs in a more coordinated way. It's a lesson that's stayed with me, a lesson I've never forgotten, a lesson about a more informed and responsive way of working with the people who we work with, alongside people from the community. Yes, indeed, it was a turning point, and as I say, one I've never forgotten.
And then, just as we did here in the United States, you turned to the Canadians for inspiration, correct?
Absolutely. Our own What Works, we use that term, which was certainly current at that time, our own What Works experience was developing, helped by a growing national perspective, researchers from our various separate services coming together, one of the first times they'd done that, including also a major push on the part of our inspectorate, a national service. And, it's amazing, I think really important how one great leader can really, really help things to shift. And that was the case for us at that time. And alongside our growing national perspective, we added an international perspective, and that was the Canadian experience, which, of course, at that time was primarily based on risk needs responsivity. And borrowing or inspired by, a combination really of borrowing and inspiration on the part of our knowledge of Canadian work, we established 5 independently evaluated cognitive skills pathfinders, as we called them, 5 cognitive skills programs. And it was a huge step for us. The value of learning from colleagues who have done it, if you like, inspiring, adding to our own experience. It saved us reinventing the wheel. It allowed us to go at a pace in developing our evidence-based practice that we hadn't contemplated previously. But, great as that was, it wasn't quite as straightforward as we imagined. Did we have some learning? In a word, yes, we did, and that word is implementation. Well, we found, because as I say, our programs were very large scale, right across the country, and they were independently evaluated. So what did we find? We found that the cognitive skills programs are indeed effective. They reduced reoffending, but only when they're well implemented, and only with a relatively small group of the people who we targeted. Risk, did we target well enough? Need, were we addressing the most important needs? Responsivity, we had a significant dropout, and that was probably the biggest issue for us. But those implementation issues, they also included the demand of training, getting the training right, ensuring delivery integrity, such an important issue as we all know in terms of cognitive skills programs, and the cost of the resource demands as well. So the conclusions, this was enormously helpful for us, and we haven't looked back. But at the same time, it was too much, too fast. And perhaps, as one of our independent evaluators later said, perhaps rather than going to great scale so quickly as we did, it's better to take a little bit more of an iterative approach to learning of it, testing, learning as we go. If you like, we also put too many eggs in one basket. We needed to adapt to our own circumstances. We needed to attend to a range of needs. As I was saying a little bit earlier in relation to the civil disturbances, we needed to focus on social factors too. So what we did, and we were building on the Canadian experience, we added the discipline of what works and applied it in research to a whole range of social factors, to employment, to reintegration, to community service, pro-social modelling. And our work actually included 7 prison to probation reintegration pathfinders, which I was privileged to lead. So yes, some lessons for us. Wonderful help, huge experience. It helped us to go faster, but we needed to adapt. We needed to make sure we were addressing our own needs and to expand the range of needs that we were focused on.
Stephen, I absolutely love the fact that you brought up implementation in your response, which I agree, that's really the next frontier out there. And I contend what a lot of corrections agencies struggle with. They've gotten the evidence-based portion down, but again, nobody's really reinventing that risk needs responsivity mousetrap. The devil's in the details, though, when it comes to the implementation. And I know that our listeners who may have had a chance to attend the recent APPA Training Institute in Chicago, hopefully had a chance to connect with Glenn Tapia and Alex Walker and the great team from ACJI, who are really doing a lot of groundbreaking work, distilling that somewhat can be abstract implementation science, but really reframing it through the correctional lens to help those in corrections, again, really leverage the knowledge around implementation. Because as you said, Stephen, that's really the next frontier. So I have been getting more and more experiences working with European corrections officials and helping them with their burgeoning probation systems. Can you share some of your experiences building new probation organizations in nations in which their probation systems are still, relatively in their infancy?
Indeed, and that's been a wonderful focus of my own career, my own work for perhaps the last 20 years or so. I mean, listeners will know of the 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the huge changes in Europe that followed. Many will know, but perhaps not everyone, about the work we've been doing in Europe to build new probation organizations. We've established more than 12 new probation services in Central, in Eastern Europe in the last decade or two, and that work is continuing and extending actually to other areas like the Caucasus or Eurasia, as sometimes referred to. But let me mention, if I may, one particular experience, because it's a personal one. So rather than talking about the collective here, my own experience, I worked in Bulgaria and for 2 years, and it was a wonderful professional and personal experience. It was also an honour. I mean that. It was an honour to be resident for 2 years, closely involved with the work of justice departments in their developments, working alongside colleagues in Bulgaria. And the relationships, the friendships that were established, they endure still to this day. The way that these projects work, they were then, and many still are, funded by the European Union. And the EU funds bilateral projects to develop alternatives to prison. That's usually the key initial focus, alternatives to imprisonment, not least because of overcrowding in prisons following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the projects are known as twinning projects. They are bilateral, as I say. They involve Bulgaria, or whichever is the host country, and one other country. There's a bidding process, and we won the bidding process to work with Bulgaria. And I'm sure that our What Works experience that we've been discussing earlier today helped in that. We're also, of course, a very well-established service, well over 100 years. A project plan is developed. It's prepared in advance by the European Union. and then delivered, which is where I came in, by myself as a resident twinning advisor and by visiting colleagues, mainly from the United Kingdom, who work with Bulgarian counterparts. I think we did a lot of good. But as a professional, it's important to learn lessons, to review and to learn lessons. So with hindsight, looking back on that, some conclusions. Well, let me say, first of all, I have a huge respect for my colleagues in Bulgaria. They set out not only to create an entirely new national organization, but to do that during a period of transition, of transformation of the justice system from a more authoritarian to a more rehabilitative penal approach. And as a foreign provider, an overseas provider, what's really important is to put ourselves in the beneficiaries or the host country's shoes, to appreciate the challenges, the significant changes in culture and operations at all levels of the justice system, including with staff, particularly older staff who are more used to a previous approach. And, the probation service doesn't exist in isolation. A new service will not exist in isolation. It's a part of a wider justice system, and that justice system, too, is changing. They're on their own journeys, and they may be subject to their own internal and external pressures. And there can be resistances. The probation service may be seen as a competitor on occasion. So we also need to understand the demand on capacity, on resources, and to consider priorities, speed, and how well, just to get a little bit technical for a moment, how well does policy or practice transfer work? Certainly, our experience was we shouldn't transfer it just because it's working in the twinning country. There may be better options. We need to check for appropriateness. We need to pilot, adapt, and we're talking here about assessment systems. We're talking about cognitive skills programs, about structures for delivering community service work, about pre-sentence reports, training, which of course needs to be accompanied by support and appropriate changes in the rest of the organization. So this is a huge challenge, absolutely not to be underestimated, and so important, therefore, to adopt a partnership approach, to really work together to find good solutions. And one of the learning points, and it's the way we now do things in our European projects, is to try to adopt a multilateral approach rather than a bilateral, so that a country new to probation can experience different approaches, even though the value base may be the same or similar, and then to adopt and adapt. And I think that's more supportive of ownership and of sustainability. And it's especially the case if a lending country, one of the multilateral partners, has made a similar journey. So I think some learning points there. And by the way, beneficiary countries, including Bulgaria and many others, frequently go on then to support other countries building their own new services and to participate as equal partners in European research and knowledge exchange projects. So it's a shift, from bilateral to multilateral and to knowledge exchange over time.
Yeah, that's a very good point. As you said about some of those nations then giving back. I have been doing some work with Iwan Dernescu, who's over in Romania. But to your point, Romanian's probation system, I believe, is only about 20 years old. But that hasn't stopped those Romanian folks from turning around and resharing their knowledge. In fact, Professor Dernescu's International Training School on Core Correctional Skills is focusing on a lot of those same Central and European nations. So again, it's a bit of that generativity, to coin a phrase.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And the core skills program is, I think, a really very, very interesting one. I know it well, and perhaps in a sense, without going into too much detail here about it, but I think it is a way of taking cognitive skills programs, for example, and tailoring them to the needs of services that are new to the work and whose staff are new and so forth.
I could not agree more. And again, when folks ask me what my experiences have been like training those folks overseas on what we refer to as core correctional skills or core correctional practices, my takeaway is that, yes, there's a lot of similarities, but we have to make sure that we recognize and honor the contextual differences, the cultural differences. So as you were saying, Stephen, whether it's cognitive behavioral interventions, one theme I picked up was from the European lens, at least, there's a larger push towards, it's really about perspective taking. I could even say the same thing, for example, with motivational interviewing. And of course, I'm aware there's the network of MINT trainers, right? The motivational interviewing network of trainers, and it's a worldwide organization. But again, at least through the corrections lens, I see how motivational interviewing is trained slightly different than we train it here. And again, it takes on more of that perspective taking. So again, it's just great to learn on the world stage. And like, as you were saying, not only I'm growing myself as a trainer and a facilitator, training to these other populations and seeing what works on them, what they respond to, how to take into account their nuanced cultural differences. So it's a win-win in that regard. Yes, we don't. So, Stephen, we are both members of APPA, the American Probation and Parole Association. But can you tell our listeners about a similar organization of professionals across the Atlantic known as CEP, the Confederation of European Probation?
I certainly can. I'm very happy to. The CEP was established in 1982 by a small group of Western European countries, and its name at that point primarily was knowledge exchange. CEP now has more than 40 member jurisdictions, comprising service delivery organizations, but also universities. There's always an academic representative on the board of the CEP, a number of NGOs, and also individuals. In fact, I'm proud to act as an ambassador to the CEP, and yes, proud indeed to be an ambassador to such an important organization in the field of probation. In terms of activities, a wide range of activities, research involving multiple countries, expert groups again across Europe with representatives from many countries, website, and some of the content of the website includes a series of articles, A Day in the Life, which was actually initiated during the pandemic, but will, I'm sure, continue. It's such a popular one, providing insights into the work of probation officers in different countries, different jurisdictions. The website contains a knowledge base, an ebook, Probation in Europe, which goes into quite some detail about every service, every probation service in Europe. And we produce also a regular e-newsletter. We hold conferences and topics. For example, recently and upcoming are electronic monitoring, also with a look at artificial intelligence, reintegration following release from prison, radicalization prevention, mental health, desistance, violent and sexual offenders, restorative justice. A wide range, and that's only some of them. Forthcoming in October in Croatia, a conference on human rights and ethics. Newer services, just to follow through our last discussion, newer services, of course, a very important part of the CEP family, and they sit on the CEP board alongside the more established services, and they also increasingly host conferences, several of which have a particular focus on capacity building, on building new probation services. So that's a really very important part of the work of the CEP.
Stephen, just as you and I, as members of the American Probation and Parole Association, are part of this international outreach to expand APPA membership, are there opportunities or roles, or if an American listener, probation or parole officer is listening, are there opportunities or situations where they could get involved in CEP?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the CEP is, the website is freely available. All of those, let me just, as I speak, check through them. Yes, all of those, the reports of research groups, the expert groups, the website, the e-newsletter, the reports of conferences are all available. They're all available to read and to review. There are ways in which we can work together, and I think it would be actually very helpful to look further at that topic. But one of the ways in which we can do that, in which APPA members and CEP members can cooperate, can collaborate, are through organisations like the World Congress on Probation. I'd be very happy to go into that.
Yeah, perfect segue. You brought it up. Let's talk about the World Congress on Probation coming up here in Ottawa.
Yeah, that's right. Coming up very, very soon, later this month. In fact, from the 27th of September to the 1st of October. And, it'll be the 5th World Congress, the first 5th World Congress on probation and parole or community corrections. And, speaking about collaboration between APPA and the CEP, I'm so pleased that several members of the IRC will attend and participate in the 5th World Congress alongside a strong CEP engagement. Let me just take you back, if I may, to the origins of the World Congress, because it speaks to your question. The CEP and APPA have had a long-standing relationship and goes back very many years. And we actually have an affiliation agreement, which we will review again shortly. And the relationship between the CEP and APPA helped to sow the seeds for knowledge exchange and for the World Congress movement some 15 years ago. It was a joint idea, a joint initiative. And then we can add to that the good fortune I had during my time leading the international unit of the England and Wales Prison and Probation Services, my good fortune in working closely with several Japanese colleagues and to have become familiar during visits to Japan with their system, including their expansive volunteer probation officer arrangement. So I could see the benefits of exchange also between Europe and Asian jurisdictions. That was an additional motivation to exchange experiences globally. But the first World Congress was hosted in London in 2013 by the CEP, working with the National Offender Management Service, which at that time was my own organisation, the statutory government organisation for prison and probation services in England and Wales. So World of Probation, Perspectives on Community Justice. But a decision to hold the second World Congress in the USA had already been jointly made between APPA and the CEP. And steps to hold the third Congress, which took place in Japan, were taken at that first event in London. So the contacts, all gel together in the decision-making about moving forward. And the second Congress was delivered in the USA, in LA, in tandem with an APPA training institute. I recall that event, which, like the first Congress in London, was tremendous, really. And I remember the learning from a great range of workshops. And I also recall the very significant steps, as we were in California at that point, towards reducing incarceration. And I've been privileged to be involved in all 5 World Congresses, including the third in Tokyo, the fourth in Sydney, which was another very successful Congress with a primarily evidence-based practice focus, and then Ottawa to follow later this month. So congresses are supported today by several organizations, by the CEP, by APPA, but also by the International Community Corrections Association, who helped to host the Congress in LA, the International Corrections and Prisons Association, ICPA, also important partners, the United Nations Asia and Far East Institute, or UNIFE, in Tokyo, and the Rehabilitation Bureau of Japan, as well as the specific host countries too. So our fifth Congress in Ottawa, as I say, 28th of September to 1st of October, preceded by study visits, is titled Leaving No One Behind, Building Community Capacity. This fifth Congress, it promises to be at least as great as the others. We're bringing together experts, researchers, practitioners from around the world, and as I say, very significant contribution from members of APPA and IRC. And the Congress will explore the challenges, opportunities, and success stories involved in building community capacity and sustaining partnerships that support successful reintegration for diverse groups in our evolving global environment. In other words, we're going to be focusing a lot, again, as we mentioned just now, on the topic of responsivity and aiming to take that further. And we know far more, I think, in recent years about responsivity. For example, the pathways of women into crime and how pathways out of crime often differ in important respects from the prevailing models that have been developed for men, such as the benefits of a more trauma-informed and relational style. And at the Congress, we're going to direct part of our focus on women, on work with women in the community, on reintegration following a period in custody, and also specifically on the parole process. And I think I'm right in saying that's not something that until recently has received sufficient attention. We're also growing our understanding of and improving our work with people with mental ill health. That's going to be another strong focus of the Congress. And we will pay attention to work with Indigenous people and of differences too within groups of First Nation people, including First Nation women and youth. And I'm struck by the power of service user involvement in service development, captured, for example, in part at least by the expression "nothing about us without us." And looking back, it seems incredible to me that we haven't always worked closely with our service users, developing specific services with those that use them. And another important focus of the Congress, I mentioned previously the role of communities, and not least people who volunteer. And we're going to have a number of workshops exploring that from different perspectives around the world.
I'm so glad you mentioned that the IRC, the International Relations Committee, will have a presence there. If you're listening and if you have the opportunity to be attending the World Congress, please search out those IRC members from APPA and give them a Criminologist podcast hello. I also want to say, I believe my good friend Iuliana Carbunaru from Romania will be presenting at the World Congress. So again, if you're there, track down Iuliana and say hello from me. Unfortunately, I cannot attend. Stephen, I love the fact that you brought up, well, a lot of great things, but in particular, when you were talking about your experiences with Japan, could you maybe highlight, I also think that we're really not looking enough at our volunteers, but I know Japan took a unique approach to this. Could you maybe highlight some of your experiences with their approach to better utilizing volunteers in corrections?
Yeah, I'd be very, very happy to do that. Well, Japan, volunteer probation officers, I think this has been and remains a wonderful example of knowledge transfer. I mentioned the involvement of Japan in the whole World Congress movement, hosting of the third Congress, but they've also presented at others too. And for many in the West, the Japanese experience of volunteers has been an eye-opener. I think it's been a motivator to re-examine our relationship with volunteers and our relationship with the community as a whole. Japan has one of the lowest rates of imprisonment in the world. I think the recent figure was 45 per 100,000 population prisoners. They have up to about 50,000 volunteers permitted in law, and about 1,000 professional probation officers. It's to most of us in the West, it's a very surprising ratio of volunteers to professional probation officers. And the probation officers support the volunteers, and they also supervise directly, they manage directly the higher risk people in the community. The Japanese refer to the volunteers as sogoshi, and it's clear to me that those volunteers demonstrate many of the qualities of evidence-informed desistance work. For example, their relational style supports motivation and hope and demonstrates respect for the individual and their potential. And I've spent quite a lot of time with volunteers talking to them about their work and about their approach. They also help to unblock community obstacles and connect the people they're supporting with work and practical resources. They coach, if you like, and they mentor. And in the process, they help to demystify probation work for the community. And volunteers are accompanied by a younger group of volunteers, specifically to support younger offenders, and more than 22,000 well-disposed employers. So this is a fantastic example of active community involvement in support of reintegration and rehabilitation, and how this is encouraged and supported by the Japanese probation service. And by the way, Japan is not alone. Several Asian countries have strong volunteer programs, and they are being strengthened in some African jurisdictions too, although Japan is, I think, the most developed. And what a fantastic example for us in the West to reflect on and to emulate.
Yes, and I hesitate to use the term because it's beat to death, but it really is an example of thinking outside the box of how, again, they're just leveraging that capacity in ways that we would not even, shouldn't say we wouldn't consider it, but again, it's a bigger cultural shift here, at least in the United States. So for example, Stephen, when you were talking earlier, you used that term service user, used it a few times, and undoubtedly there are perhaps American listeners who haven't connected the dots that don't realize, when Stephen talks about service users, that's what many probation officers refer to as the offender. But again, those cultural changes start with small things like the language that we use. You mentioned evidence-informed desistance work. Longtime listeners of this podcast will know that I love talking about desistance whenever I get the chance. Could I ask you to expand on that? I know previously we or I at least, was sort of thanking our Canadian counterparts for getting risk needs responsivity off the ground. I often turn to European colleagues, such as yourself, to highlight some of those emerging desistance models. So again, Stephen, could you maybe talk more about what you meant when you were talking about evidence-informed desistance work?
Yeah. Well, let me highlight just.
Was that Stephen? Was that your "how much time do we have" chuckle there?
Let's just highlight a few points. One way of putting this, and I think it's one of several helpful ways, is R&R is perhaps looking at what's taken people into offending, and desistance is how we work with people and how they themselves take themselves out of offending, out of reoffending. There are a number of important tenets, a number of important foundations to desistance work, and one of them. And it also applies, I think, to R&R, but it's more evidence with desistance work, is the importance of the of relations, of the relational style of the worker, of the probation officer, and the person that they're working with. That can be a real tool for change. And one of the reasons it can be a tool for change, and we touched on this speaking about the volunteers in Japan, is that it can help to help the person we're managing or supervising, the service user, to have a different view, a more positive view, or an optimistic view about their future. And a lot of desistance work is about how service users can think about themselves and help to shape their own future in a positive way. It's a kind of aspect of what we might call human capital. And another very important aspect, social capital, unblocking obstacles. And again, when we spoke about volunteers in Japan, they unblock obstacles in the community for the people that they're working with. So when people change, they need to be on that journey of desistance. They need to be supported. And they certainly need not to be hindered by the community. And again, one of the strengths of the Japanese approach is that the volunteers help to align the community in ways which is supportive of a change in the way that the service users are thinking about themselves, the way that they're behaving. So the community then becomes a supporter for change and not an obstacle, which, as I'm afraid we know it too often can be. So that's a little bit off the cuff, speaking about desistance. I don't know whether I've helped there. That was just my first thoughts.
No, that was brilliant. We have a lot of the same thoughts. Again, when I give my elevator speech about the differences between the risk, need, responsivity approaches and the desistance approaches, as you said, Stephen, risk, need, responsivity tends to focus on those pathways into a life of crime and delinquency, whereas desistance is examining those pathways out of crime and delinquency. And believe it or not, folks, they're not necessarily the same. And there are, again, some subtle, nuanced differences. And again, you refer to this, Stephen, but for example, in risk, need, responsivity world, when we address that criminogenic need of companions, it's really about, again, suppressing those negative peers, or at best we say, well, you have to surround yourself with pro-social people, but I sometimes somewhat cynically think, well, that on a risk assessment, that would just mean having friends and acquaintances who, for example, have never been arrested. But that's different than, again, you alluded to this, building one's social capital, which is much more about surrounding yourselves with individuals who afford you opportunities. A probationer can have as many quote-unquote pro-social people in their lives. Again, if you're measuring this a la a risk assessment, maybe, again, someone who has a job and has never been arrested, but that's a little bit different than building one's social capital. Yeah, and again, for my listeners out there, particularly if you're new, we love talking about desistance on this podcast. So go back and check out some of the great interviews I've done with some real thought leaders in the field here, including Fergus McNeil, Shad Maruna, Sarah Lewis, among others. Yeah. So, Stephen, we're talking about the World Congress, and I know you've got a workshop that you're going to be presenting on up there. Can you give folks an idea of what that's all about, either if they're attending the World Congress and or maybe give some more context as to some of the great work being done at these events?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. Well, the workshop is building capacity in community-based provision. And, that's really necessary because if we're going to deliver community-based practice, then we need to have community-based services. And why a workshop? Why a project on developing the capacity of probation-related services? Well, there's a few reasons. One of those is that despite the concerted international effort and the resources to expand community alternatives, they remain underdeveloped or underused in many of the world's regions, whilst prison populations continue to expand. It's a quite extraordinary situation in some ways, I would say. And we have a lack of research and a lack of understanding of good practices in practice transfer and building community-based capacity. We were touching on these subjects a little bit in relation to work in Bulgaria earlier on. And, capacity building, it doesn't always achieve expected results, although there are plenty of examples of fantastic, great projects, huge successes in terms of legislation, organisation, professionalism. We've been speaking about some of those in Europe today. And, every instance of capacity building is unique. Transitioning democracies, fragile states, more established services that are updating. And with all this complexity, can we identify examples of good practice and perhaps some missteps to avoid? Because this is the way in which we're going to really try to make, and I hope succeed in making, a sea change in the availability of probation practices around the world, probation services around the world. So with a colleague, Leo Tigges, from the Netherlands, and incidentally, Leo was, by the way, a previous Secretary General of the CEP. Together, we've been leading a 3-year research project on international practices and building effective community-based services. And our project has focused on 5 European countries. Each of them has introduced or strengthened their community-based services since the millennium. We've talked to service leaders, politicians, judicial and community stakeholders. We've also talked to supranational organizations and consultants involved in policy exchange and capacity building, and we've conducted a literature review. And we have insights too from experience of capacity building, our own experience of capacity building around the world. So we're going to present and refine this work in Ottawa. How do we build, how do we strengthen community-based services? And in particular, we want to offer a capacity building model, a framework or language to support knowledge exchange, and then discuss what we believe are some of the critical elements in building and sustaining successful probation organizations. There are some very important lessons here, I think. The importance of context. We've touched on this a little bit already today. Probation, including a new service, is part of a wider penal system. In turn, that's part of a bigger social, cultural, economic system. The penal system is influenced by public sentiment, welfare provision, income equality, political and legal culture. And capacity building often takes place at a time of broader change with the all-round uncertainty this may bring. So even without the complications of national context, the process of practice transfer and capacity building can be complex, particularly, therefore, between jurisdictions with different political, penal and cultural traditions. And so what can we say about this? Well, the importance of planning and assessment, taking time to work together to jointly understand what's required and to develop that joint strategy and plan. Well, perhaps that sounds obvious, but our experience is that often doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen anything like sufficiently. The partners have not got to know each other sufficiently well. And sometimes the reason for that is that a project is developed by a supranational organization or by a donor, not by those who are going to deliver it, who arrive at the time, at the start of project delivery time. We need to clarify the why, the motivations of the key players, what needs to be addressed. And, those motivations can vary over time, including as implementation and implications of implementation proceed. And, if we're working as experts contributing to another country, we need to get into the space of that beneficiary country, be realistic about the journey and the absorption capacity. I think I was alluding to some of this when I was speaking earlier about Bulgaria. And we need to attend to who? We need to involve the stakeholders, consider the larger picture, the penal culture, what's the power structure, where are the supports, the likely resistances. We need to plan what to deliver, what domains, if you like, of probation. Are we talking about pre-trial, post-sentence, on release from custody? Where is the focus? What's most successful? Where to start? What's most likely to meet with support? The answer seems to be a holistic view, if you like, but delivered step by step, so where to begin. And then very importantly, all of what we call the enablers of probation work: communications, evidence-based practices, sufficient well-trained staff, partnerships, communities, infrastructure. And when we come to delivery, we need to review all of those. Capacity building, we say it's more like a cloud than a clock. It's hard to predict all the systems, reactions, and circumstances. We need to allow for flexibility. We need to pilot and adapt as necessary. And we need to develop cooperation really between donors, providers, to avoid gaps, to avoid duplications. And all of this is helped by staff continuity if possible. Well, that's a little bit of a flyer, if you like, for the workshop. We have a whole load of good practice hints that we've put together from observing and researching practice in Europe, but also around the world. We'll be running through a lot of those, but also involving our workshop participants in bringing their own experience, enriching our understanding of what it is that helps probation services to develop and to develop strongly.
And just as I was singing the praises of those studying implementation science, Stephen, I could make the same claim for you and the work you're doing around capacity building. Again, I just think that's the natural next chapter, if you will, that we have to continue to look at how we can improve not just what we're delivering, but how we deliver it. Right?
Yeah, absolutely, I agree.
What is on the horizon for Stephen Pitts? Steve, when I have you back on the show in a year or two, look into your crystal ball for me. What do you think we might be discussing?
I think I'm fortunate. It's hard to imagine anything much more rewarding than my present work. But what I'd like to be doing, I'd like to be continuing to support probation development, not least through organizations such as the CEP, APPA, ICPA, the United Nations, who I'm working with at the moment, the Council of Europe and others. But to be more specific, I'd like to focus on exchange to assist the growth of services in those regions of the world where they are least developed. And then for those I'd like to see those regional networks evolving in the same way that we have APPA in the United States, the CEP in Europe. I'd love to see regional networks in other parts of the world, leading to increased collaboration in those regions and then to exchange on an equal footing within the regions and between regions globally. So yeah, that's what I'd love to see, and I really want to be a part of that, to developing our understanding and our work to support services, particularly newer services around the world.
Stephen, I appreciate your infinite mindset and your enthusiasm. We need more folks like you on the world stage. Stephen Pitts joining us all the way from London. Stephen, I look forward to having you back on the show and or seeing you at our next IRC meeting. Take care of yourself, my friend.
Thank you.
A big Criminologist podcast thank you to Stephen Pitts joining us all the way from Great Britain. I will leave some links if you're interested in the World Congress, the Confederation of European Probation, or, of course, the American Probation and Parole Association. I'll leave those links right in the episode description of the show you just listened to, so you can have easy access to all those outstanding resources. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. go ahead and give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, or Stephen Pitts on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this program. Merchandise is available. Visit our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, and look for the Shop tab for information on how you can secure your Criminologist coffee mug, pen, or refrigerator magnet. And if you believe in what we're doing on the program, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the program. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
And alongside our growing national perspective, we added an international perspective, and that was the Canadian experience, which, of course, at that time was primarily based on risk needs responsivity.
This has been a special APPA edition of the Criminologist podcast. Their international relations team looks forward to sharing the insights of other subject matter experts from around the world in future episodes. The Criminologist podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.